next speaker is Jason Berke, who will be presenting a paper entitled The Morality of Abortion Through the Lens of Kantian Ethics and Utilitarianism. Jason.
Hi, everyone. Abortion, easily the most diversive topic of the contemporary era. It ends conversations, it starts arguments. It's a terrible thing to talk about, but that's what I'm going to do here. So there are plenty of perspectives on abortion in terms of the morality of it. We've got religious perspectives, there are legal perspectives, biological ones, and plenty in the realm of philosophy. Specifically, I want to talk today about abortion in terms of Kantian ethics and utilitarianism. So, as any good philosophical debate starts out, let's define our terms. Abortion is a surgical, intentional termination of pregnancy prior to the 24-week period. I use this 24-week period as a cutoff because it's empirically determined as the point of viability at which the fetus is viable to survive outside of the womb. So that allows me to avoid accusations of infanticide and to demarcate between potential life and current human living life. So let's get right into it. Utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is the maxim that right actions are those that produce the best overall outcome for those who will be affected by the action. So in the case of abortion, or in terms of potential life, who's affected? The mother or the parents, the child or future adult, and society. Now, the latter, society, doesn't really fit the scope of my paper, so while it is important, I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist for the sake of my paper, or presentation, I should say. So how's the mother impacted? Monetarily, obviously, the USDA has done studies about the socioeconomic status and how socioeconomic status relates to the amount that it costs to rear a child. And no matter where you come from and what status you have, the costs are inevitably very high. Stress. I can attest as a former child that I caused my parents an undue amount of stress. They didn't deserve it, and they will swear up and down that I caused them a lot of happiness too, but regardless, that happiness comes at a rather high cost. So the child. Inevitably, a child not born cannot experience pain or pleasure. So it's far more difficult to measure the potential happiness that a child could potentially have. You can't really tell whether they're going to grow up popular or get a job right out of college, as some of us are worried about, and other things of that nature. So we don't have enough information to really discuss the potential happiness in the same way that we have metrics to talk about the mother's potential happiness or potential cost. So without that sort of information, let's talk about why a woman might abort in the first place and scenarios that lead her to needing to make such a decision. In a perfect utilitarian universe, the woman would be emotionally able, financially stable, all of the complications and all of the life changes that are involved in rearing a child would be taken into account, and we wouldn't have too much of an issue when, in any case where a woman was pregnant, they would be, okay, I'm ready, let's do it. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen a lot of the time. So, especially in cases like non-consensual sex or in terms of accidents because birth control isn't perfect, you're going to eventually come across a situation where it's not the ideal scenario for a mother to be giving birth. So the next question is then, why do sometimes women get into situations, even if it's not a matter of non-consensual sex or an accident? Women have sex for pleasure. I know that's shocking in the 21st century, but it does happen. So the question is, should people stop having non-procreative sex? And I think the utilitarian would have a resounding absolutely not. They should be able to do that. That's a good thing. If you really think about it, except for the few cases in which we have an issue of an unintentional pregnancy, the vast majority of the time, I think it's a net positive in terms of the overall pleasure or happiness in the world. So sex is a good thing. We've got that settled, I think. Now, what remains is this problem of potential life, of this issue of, is something that is not yet existing but may be existing a valuable thing morally or intrinsically? We recognize the intrinsic value of current life, and I'm going to take that as an assumption because I think we can all generally agree that there is something intrinsically valuable, certainly on a spectrum compared to the non-living entity. But what about life that could be or is on its way to be? So Peter Singer, utilitarian philosopher, says that early unborn humans don't feel pain, they can't act rationally, and they're not self-aware, so they're not intrinsically valuable. This is a rather strong claim to make, but I think that for the sake of my argument, we're going to discuss that as if it were true. So I'm going to take a sort of step to the side here and talk about the biology of potential life. As I just learned last semester taking my first college biology course, we have, well, I didn't just learn this, but the male and female have each haploids, and when put together, these haploid cells become a diploid or a zygote, which becomes a human life, potentially, if all goes well. So the haploid cells, the sperm and the egg respectively, are a form of potential life. Are they themselves valuable? And this is an argument that gets tossed around all the time. It's a question of, are they only valuable once they come together and form the zygote? It's not entirely clear. But if sperm and egg are valuable intrinsically, then that might be a problem in terms of wasting egg and sperm. Could be considered a moral offense, in a sense. So one of the biological examples that I wanted to talk about is octopi. Octopi are known to be rather intelligent comparatively to most of the animals. And they give birth to thousands of eggs at a time. And these thousands of eggs, very few of them make it out of them. As an intelligent species, should we be morally bothered by the fact that there are thousands of potentially intelligent creatures that are not making it to fruition? It's not entirely clear. So I'm going to look at a couple of statistics that might shed a little bit of light on society's view, at the very least, on the idea of potential life. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists note that 15% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage. That's a rather significant number. I think it's safe to say that if 15% of the entire human population were to be in danger, the current living human population, we would have a bit of a moral outcry about it. It would be a severely problematic thing for us. Interestingly enough, the World Food Program estimates that 13.5% of the world is dying of starvation right now. And so obviously, when we see that we have programs in place, like the World Food Program, to solve world hunger and to try to feed these people and save them, we clearly place a much higher moral value on people that are already living than those of miscarriages. While miscarriages are certainly an incredibly upsetting thing for everyone involved, we don't seem to be doing nearly as much science trying to figure out how to stop them. So I think that at least sheds some light on the societal view on which is significantly more important than the other, human life that's living or potential life. So I'm going to draw a couple conclusions on utilitarianism, tentative obviously, because this is philosophy. So women should be allowed to have pleasure-based sex. That's one conclusion I think we can all pretty much agree on. Women unfit, unready, or otherwise uninterested in rearing a child should be allowed to abort because potential life is a fickle idea to begin with. A lot of them don't make it to fruition, and it's not entirely clear whether or not they're intrinsically valuable. We value infants because after the 24-week point, they're viable, and they're essentially a human, and they're on their way to becoming human virtually without question. And the absurd consequences of talking about potential life as intrinsically or morally valuable get a little bit hazy. We can talk about things like wasting eggs and sperm as being a moral problem, and additionally there are statistics that show that there's an increase in likelihood for miscarriage for excessive coffee drinking during pregnancy, for excessive amounts of stress during pregnancy, and a lot of other things that perhaps most people aren't aware of and also can't control. So should we hold a mother morally responsible if she's a little bit extra stressed during pregnancy and it leads to a miscarriage? It's not entirely clear, but these are conclusions that I'd prefer that society steer clear from because they seem rather complicated. So I'm going to move on to Kantian ethics. The first of the two specific parts of Kantian ethics I'm going to talk about is this idea of universalizability, that any maxim that should be put upon one person should be universalizable. Everyone should have to abide by it. So philosopher Harry Gensler has an argument based on this, which goes, if you can do A to X, then someone can do A to you. If someone can do A to you, then you would have to consent to them doing A to you because you've agreed that they're allowed to do it to X. So if you find it acceptable for anyone to choose abortion, you essentially would have to consent to your own abortion in similar circumstances. Now, the immediate reaction I tend to have when I think about this is that seems rather absurd. And I really gave it some thought, and I figured out why it sounds absurd. Because to compare the consciousness of an embryo and the consciousness of a fully formed adult is completely incoherent. We can't talk about our own abortion because to abort a fully grown adult is called murder. My mother can't suddenly decide that I'm inconvenient for her and want to abort me. So, with that said, I'm not sure that we have to only address this argument from the sense of absurdity. I think we can address this fairly without dealing with that. So he uses this terminology of similar circumstances, which I think is the downfall of his entire argument, that given these circumstances, which let's consider a couple of circumstances that a woman might want to abort a child. She's not ready. She doesn't have the financial background to take care of the child. So in similar circumstances, if my mother were completely unable to take care of me emotionally or practically, I think it's safe to say that if I were able to reflect on myself and decide whether or not I would want to be born, I wouldn't want to be born in such a negative environment. That doesn't seem like a valuable situation for me to put myself in. So I would agree in this case to my own abortion. Now, that is almost certainly not a universally held view, but I think that a case can be made for it rather strongly. So the second, and I personally think more compelling problem, although I'm not well versed enough in Kantian ethics to conclusively say it, is this idea of using someone as merely a means to an end. And in a strange turn of phrase here, the entity that is using the mother and or child as merely a means to an end is the entire ethical framework, which I'm not sure if that's a problem. Now, both the mother and potential child are affected as being used merely as a means to an end in this scenario. The mother is affected as merely a means to an end because if she were to choose that she wouldn't want this child, the entire ethical framework is saying, no, we have a maximum to preserve life, therefore you must hold on to this child. So she is absolved of her ability to act as a rational agent and decide what she wants to do with this child. On the other hand, and I think even more upsettingly, the child is used as merely a means to an end. The child has no capacity yet for rational thought, and yet the mother or society or the ethical framework, I should say, are putting this child in a position where the child would have no potential say, just like in the Gensler issue of if a child could reflect on their own abortion, would they choose to have it? So there's this issue of if a child is born to a mother in terrible circumstances, wouldn't it be a little bit safe to say that the child wouldn't want to be a burden on their parents, wouldn't want to be born in such an environment, and wouldn't want to have that be their defining factor, that the mother just chose not to have an abortion because of this maxim to preserve life? So both of them are being used as a means to an end here. And I think, while there are certainly many finer aspects of the discussion, I think that provides a reasonably sound case for the morality of abortion through the lens of Kantian ethics and utilitarianism. Thank you.